Hi everyone, welcome to the first video of a series of interviews with lecturers from the International Development Department at the University of Birmingham. I'm Neluni, I'm from Sri Lanka, and I'm a Shieveling scholar currently following an MSc in Conflict, State Building and Development here at the university. So our first interview today is with Dr. Jonathan Fisher. Welcome, Dr. Jonathan Fisher.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Jonathan is the head of IDD and is a reader in African politics. So we're going to dive straight into this conversation, Dr. Jonathan. So it's just going to be around democratic systems and authoritarian systems. And I'm keeping an open mind when comparing the two, but I want to ask first, democracy has been so popular and just so trusted, and especially in the global north and to a large extent in the global south as well. And it's been characterized by concepts like good governance. We've been having words like and terms like inclusion, human rights, transparency and accountability spoken about so much. But the very countries where these terms seem to have originated from are now, it seems like they're demonizing these terms in these supposed democracies in both the global north and south alike. So I want to know how and why do you think these terms have lost its value over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think that there are different ways of looking at this. So I think some of those terms like accountability or transparency, I think some of the reasons why people are a bit more cynical about these in the global north is because they increasingly see kind of what some people might perceive as hypocrisy or lack of delivery on those agendas by the main people that are pushing them. So, for example, Donald Trump in the US, a lot of his campaign when he became president was about draining the swamp. So, you know, removing kind of corporate interests and Washington insiders from his administration. But then when he's come to power, he's put a lot of, former corporate CEOs into his cabinet. He's brought all, the diplomatic corps. A lot of his sort of advisors are Washington insiders from a long time ago. And indeed, he's got members of his family as senior advisors. So I think there's an element there where people hear one thing but see something different, and that kind of undermines some of these concepts. I think if we think about it in relation to the global south as well, increasingly some of these terms like accountability or good governance have become sort of embedded within the world of development programs. There's so many projects called good governance program or government policies which are about transparency, this, that or the other. So they've become part of a kind of buzzword culture rather than necessarily something which is meaningful. And I think often when people are putting together project applications to secure funding from governments or from aid donors, these become sort of just tick box exercises. What are you doing for accountability? What are you doing for transparency? How is this related to good governance? So there's a gap between sometimes how the words are actually being used and what's being done in reality. But I think to sort of look at it from a more positive perspective, we also have terms. I mean, these kind of terms came from a particular time and a particular agenda, primarily the sort of post-Cold War liberal triumphalism era. But some of those ideas are still around, but in a different way. I mean, if you think about the term justice, for example, in relation to Black Lives Matter and more general global campaigns around sort of racialized and militarized policing and general inequalities, I think justice is emerging as a concept which is powerful and meaningful in a way that some of these older terms are increasingly not. So I think it's these terms develop and they have a shelf life to some extent as they go from being about kind of radical change to becoming more of the sort of institutionalized thing. And I think that that's what's happened with good governance in particular. I suppose the other thing I'd say in relation to your point about the global north is that, yes, democracy is popular. And I think what's interesting about campaigns like Brexit or the Trump election or the situation in Hungary or other things like that is these are not governments which are seeking to undermine the discourse of democracy, what they're actually doing is trying to argue that they are themselves helping to preserve democracy or restore democracy, which at the very least shows that democracy as a discourse, as something to aspire to, is at the heart of global discourse and global norms. There isn't an argument about, at least in the global north, that we should be moving into an authoritarian direction.
Okay.
And whether or not what's actually happening in those contexts is actually democratic is another question. But I think if we're thinking about words and norms, then if getting to power as a populist means you have to talk about democracy as a good thing, then at least shows that that's the main frame of reference.
Okay. Yeah, so then so superficially, at least, democracy is still what the goal is, but then the means to getting to democracy is what's being questioned more often. So there's also these, like, some people even say democracy is failing. Would you agree with that? Like, do you think democracy has actually achieved what it's promised so far?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer. I think that
it's in general.
I definitely think that people in many countries are reevaluating what democracy means or what it should mean. I think democracy has always been quite ambiguous, actually, in relation to what it's seeking to deliver. Because on the one hand, you have the sense that democracy is about the individual, that democracy is about representing the ideas and the sort of representations of the individual. And I think in a lot of countries, people are quite cynical about the fact that you have these sort of broad coalitions of, broadly centre-right and broadly centre-left parties, and there isn't really a huge amount of choice. That if you're in the US, you have either Republicans or the Democrats. If you're in the UK, we have more choice, but effectively elections come down to Conservatives or Labour. So I think that there is a bit of, probably a bit of cynicism about, what kind of choice does democracy actually represent? And particularly in countries like in the US, but also the UK, the role of money and your ability to actually enter politics only if you have a certain resource base adds to that sense of sort of lack of choice and lack of accountability. So yeah, I definitely think that there is a degree of cynicism and lack of choice there. But I think that the broader point is, what is democracy meant to mean? What is it meant to do for people? And a lot of people would see democracy as, about elections and about, being able to choose your leaders basically freely and fairly, and also being able to get rid of them. And that is something that one can do, broadly speaking, in Western democracies, Europe, North America, but also Latin America, and various other countries in the global South as well. But the question about sort of justice and human rights is a little bit more significant now. If you think about democracy as not just about people's ability to affect change of government, but also how they're treated by the state, and the sort of protections and support they enjoy, then we see a much more variegated picture. We just have to look at the impact of the COVID lockdown on different communities in democracies. So whether we're talking about the UK or India, or the US, or Australia, the impact of lockdown has been felt very differently by some communities than others, both because of income and livelihoods, but also because of the way in which they're treated by the police or by authorities. And often, not always, but often that comes down to race, as well as other social demographic aspects. So I think that in many cases people are starting to question what democracy is meant to do, and I think this probably derives, at least as far back as the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which was really when the kind of triumphalist model of Western democracy as a superior in terms of economic prosperity started crashing down. People started to really be able to see some of the more negative implications of market economics and liberal democracy and a sort of individualist model of politics. So I don't think that it's failed necessarily, because I don't necessarily think that it's it's ever really clearly promised anything.
Okay.
But I think people are starting to think about what it should be delivering, and what alternative models offer, because we're now at a time when people can compare and contrast different models of government, more so than ever before, through social media. And I think the COVID outbreak has been particularly important here, because it allows you to effectively see what different countries are doing to deal with the same crisis, and see different results coming out of different types of political system. I mean, Britain at the moment has one of the worst, if not the worst, COVID record in the whole of Europe. But if you look at some of the countries that have been successful, there isn't necessarily a clear dividing line between democracies and authoritarian states. So, you've got Singapore, Vietnam, but you've also got South Korea, New Zealand. So I think people are starting to sort of break apart, the difference between democracy as something which is a free and fair election versus something which is about how people actually function within society and the support that they receive from the state.
Yeah, no, that kind of clears actually a lot of why those questions even come up.